Last season, Devon Witherspoon took the NFL by storm, primarily thriving out of the slot. But is that where he's going to be at moving forward with Coach Mike Macdonald, or does the new coach have some new wrinkles up his sleeve in the secondary? We'll be breaking it all down on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our Wednesday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in, whether you're listening in Houston, Texas, or over in Portugal. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We're going to be continuing our pre-OTAs position group breakdowns. We're going to have our defensive position group rankings, and we're going to take a look at the slot cornerback situation, Devon Witherspoon and company in Mike Macdonald's defense, and our latest undrafted rookie free agent profiles. It's a jam-packed episode coming your way courtesy of FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. A year ago, the Seahawks were breaking in their top 5 pick, Devon Witherspoon. Many were wondering how they were going to be deploying the former Illinois star. He ended up finishing 4th in Rookie of the Year, balloting. Many, including myself, believe that was much lower than it should have been, but nonetheless was a finalist and finished 4th in balloting for Rookie of the Year honors on the defensive side of the ball. And many of his contributions happened from the slot last year, the vast majority where he was able to really be disruptive and put up a historical stat line. So looking towards his sophomore season, Rob, obviously the general consensus probably is, even with the new coach and Mike Macdonald, he's loved to blitz his corners in the past. Devon Witherspoon seems like the type of weapon that he's going to want to continue playing inside for the majority of the slot reps. And yet, at the same time, this guy was invested in a top 5 pick. Now, 2 years ago, he has been an outside shutdown corner in the past at Illinois. So there may be some differences in how he ends up deploying that position. And maybe we might see a few other guys mixed in the slot.
Yeah, I really think that this is the most fascinating decision that Mike Macdonald has to make on the defensive side of the ball. As you just articulated, Devon Witherspoon was a superstar, but primarily inside at that nickel cornerback spot. Now, he was on the field for roughly 750 plays this past season, the defensive side of the ball, as well as special teams, and 400 of them were inside at that nickel corner spot. Another 300 were outside. So it's not like Devon Witherspoon has not shown the ability to play outside. But to your point, Corbin, so many of the big plays when it came in coverage, when it came as a run defender, when it came as a blitzer and a pass rusher, came when he was lined up inside at the slot. And obviously, you are just that much closer to the quarterback, that much more opportunities for blitz packages and things of that nature. It would seem logical to keep Devon Witherspoon where he is. If it's not broke, don't fix it kind of a mentality. And considering the fact that the Seahawks drafted 2 corners that have extensive experience on the outside this year with Mike Macdonald, of course, on staff, that would seem to suggest that the Seahawks are in fact going to follow that path. At the same time, I think that they have some quality nickel cornerback behind Devon Witherspoon that they should maybe be considering at that spot and just allowing, as you said it, a former top 5 pick to excel outside, because obviously that is where the vast majority of these superstar wide receivers play the vast majority of their snaps as well. And then maybe have the ability to move Devon Witherspoon inside and out as he did, of course, under Pete Carroll. So that to me is what's going to be interesting. Again, those nickel corners that the Seahawks already have, I think that the depth chart right now, I think you have to go with the incumbent in Artie Artie Burns, who behind only Devon Witherspoon, it was second most on the Seahawks a year ago in terms of snaps from inside. I think that's where you start the conversation about, say, Kobe Bryant. Where does he fit? He was third on Seattle's roster in terms of, nickel corner reps a year ago. Trey Brown is a player that I've always been intrigued by his physicality and awareness moving back inside, although he has played almost exclusively outside. And then I think the rookie as well, DJ James from Auburn, the second of the 2 fourth-round selections, I think would be an interesting candidate to move inside as well. Again, because of his awareness, because of his physicality. But there is no doubt about the best cornerback on the field for the Seahawks is Devon Witherspoon, and that's why you've got to basically figure out what his best spot is and adjust the rest of your secondary behind him.
This really comes down to, a little bit at least, a philosophical debate here. And I feel like last year that Pete Carroll made it pretty clear what he thought about this predicament by the fact that Devon Witherspoon played more than half of his snaps on defense playing inside. The predicament here philosophically is just how valuable is that slot defender in today's NFL? And I certainly believe, I'm a subscriber to the idea that this is as important of a position in the secondary as you can have right now because of the way that offenses have changed. And think about in the NFC West, you've got Deebo Samuel, you've got Cooper Kupp, and all the stud receivers that are in this division that do a lot of their work from the inside. Having a standout corner in the slot is imperative, especially in this division. With those two-way goes, it is an imperative position to really put your resources into and be able to find quality players there. And at the same time, as you were mentioning a moment ago, you still have to contend with the stud receivers on the outside more than the guys on the inside. And so we've seen Pete Carroll in the past. He wasn't somebody that liked to have his corners travel. I'm really curious to see what Mike Macdonald does here because Devon Witherspoon has that kind of talent. He's that rare athlete and skill player at the cornerback spot that you can have travel with the best receiver, whether it's inside or out, both sides of the boundary. You can do that if you want to. And so I really want to see philosophically as a head coach with his defensive background, what Mike Macdonald does, because no offense to the corners Baltimore had last year. Marlon Humphreys had a really good career. But I don't know that he's had a guy with this upside who is this good playing inside and out like what Devon Witherspoon offers. And so I'm wondering, is he going to be sticking with the status quo, how he's handled that slot spot in the past? Or is this going to be a special exemption because, well, this guy is an incredible talent and I can do a lot of different things. I can get away with other things, moving him around. And we know how aggressive he likes to be blitzing his secondary players. So Witherspoon checks off a lot of those boxes. I'm just wondering how he's going to deploy him. And if he isn't going to be the one that's playing most of the snaps inside, there are some other intriguing options. I'm glad that you mentioned Artie Burns because that wasn't a name I was even thinking about, but he actually looked pretty solid last year in his first extensive action plan inside. That may be the only way that he can keep his roster spot with this football team. And Kobe Bryant, he's only 2 years removed from a rookie season where he forced 4 fumbles and second half of the year only gave up 1 touchdown in the slot. He really made marked improvement in his toe injury last year, limited him to only a handful of games, and he's kind of become an afterthought with the 2 rookies, Nehemiah Pritchett and DJ James, being drafted. James is the one of those 2 players, even though he actually has less career snaps at the college level in the slot than what Nehemiah Pritchett does. He's the one that when I look at skill set wise and film seems to me like the better fit to play inside. And oh, by the way, that's where the Seahawks were playing him in rookie minicamp, especially on Saturday. So that looks to be something they're looking into for him. He's a little bit more of a he's not a thick-built corner, but he's got more meat on his bones than what Nehemiah Pritchett does. And Pritchett, with his speed, he looks like a pure boundary corner to me. But James is a guy to keep a very close eye on because he is willing to come up and hit people. He's got physicality to his game. He likes to press, and I think he can handle those two-way goes playing in the slot. So there's a number of names to look at. Heck, Kayvon Wallace is another name we could throw in there. Kayvon Wallace has played a lot of snaps in the slot in his career as well. So it's not like Mike Macdonald isn't going to have options at his disposal if he's hesitant to say, look, I don't want this stud corner to just play primarily inside. I want to be able to move him around. You have some flexibility there with other options, whether it's rookies or returning veterans who have enough talent capability to be able to play significant snaps in nickel and in dime packages. You might have 2 of these guys on the field together.
Exactly, especially in the dime packages. And I love the fact that you just mentioned the dominant slot receivers that the Seahawks are going to have to go up against in the NFC West, especially Debo Samuel, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, of course, of the LA Rams as well. And then when you have such a dynamic running quarterback threat like Kyler Murray in Arizona, then the Cardinals obviously very dangerous also. The other thing is I'm sure, Corbin, there's going to be some listeners out there that are just saying, well, what about, say, a guy like a Rick Woolen or the corner who started opposite him a lot of the year a year ago? Mike Jackson, of course, was recently had his contract resettled. Both of those two guys are a little bit bigger and more physical, longer. Certainly in the case of Woolen, much faster. And some of their questions have been about playing tighter to the box, like in the case of Rick Woolen. So with Mike Jackson, I think that basically it's best to leave the veteran on the outside again because we have so many moving parts here. But I do think that it's worth noting that the one coach, of course, that was retained by the Seahawks is the defensive backs coach, Carl Scott. And so that is one thing that Mike Macdonald obviously is going to have his thoughts on this, and Undrafted as well as defensive coordinator. But I think that it's key that Carl Scott obviously has a great deal of experience. He knows Devon Witherspoon as well as the rest of the Seahawks defensive backs even better than Macdonald and Undrafted do at this point with any other position.
That might provide a little more certainty than what you're going to see elsewhere because he is the only returning assistant off Pete Carroll's staff from a year ago. At the same time, Mike Macdonald may overrule some of the things that Carl Scott wants to do. It's going to be a little bit of a negotiating effort on this front. So I am curious to see what they're going to do that slot position because, again, Devon Witherspoon is just a different level of talent for Mike Macdonald compared to other players that he's had. So I'm really fascinated to see what he's going to do on that front and how it has ripple effects in the rest of this secondary. When we return, we're going to be looking at the defense as a whole post-draft and ranking our positional groups. We did offense yesterday. Which ones stand out as the greatest strengths and what are the biggest question marks for the Seahawks now that we are closing in on the start of OTAs and eventually training camp in the 2024 season? You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. This episode is brought your way by our friends over at FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Do you think Cale Makar has a hat trick coming for the Avalanche? They look to go up 2-0 versus the Stars in the second round of the NHL playoffs. Is George Kirby going to strike out 10 or more for the Mariners on the mound in his next start? Do you think that Nikola Jokic is going to bounce back in Game 3 with 20-plus points against the Minnesota Timberwolves? You can bet on it all in an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Just a little bit of a programming note, we will have another coach from our NFL Draft Coaches Series joining for a bonus episode tomorrow. So stay tuned for the link when that drops. Can't wait to break down another one of Seattle's incoming draft picks. Let's get back to our post-draft positional rankings. Yesterday, Rob, you and I were talking about the offensive side of the football. We had 7 position groups. Defense, it's a little less specific, a little bit more broad when you have 5 position groups. But as we go through these rankings, we might break apart some of these position groups a little bit, explaining why we ranked them where we did. And again, this is based on post-draft, where things stand with the draft class, the undrafted rookies, the free agent signings, really most of the moves in the barn at this point. How is your list breaking down on defense, Rob? I guess we'll start with the bottom of the totem pole. What is the group that is taking up the rear that you think might be the biggest concern for the Seahawks on defense at this stage?
Well, I don't know if that was a Freudian slip, I guess, or, but they do take up the rear, and then the deep secondary at the safety position is going to be the position I'm going to focus in on here, as I feel like is the weakest of Seattle's current defense. Look, I'm intrigued by the addition of Rayshon Jenkins and Kayvon Wallace, but once you are making a switch from Pro Bowl players like Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams, look, say what you will about the durability issues that he had, he still was a weapon when he was healthy, and certainly Julian Love as well. But obviously, Julian Love is returning to the Seahawks. I'm excited about Jarek Reed as well. We talked about Kobe Bryant just a couple of moments ago and his positional versatility. There are some intriguing parts back there in that secondary, but at this point, it basically feels like it's a position group that we don't exactly know. It's kind of like what Mike Macdonald said when he first signed on with the Seahawks, is he doesn't know what the Seahawks do well yet. We don't really know what these safeties do well yet for the Seahawks. We can tell you that Rayshawn Jenkins and Kayvon Wallace are both physical and will come up aggressively in run support, but there have been some times they've been beaten in coverage. Julian Love, of course, proved his ability in coverage and his instincts a year ago for the Seahawks. So right now, Corbin, I think that Julian Love has got to be the safety you feel best about in pass coverage. I fully expect Rayshawn Jenkins to be their most physical run stuffer of the safety position this year.
Yeah, you and I are going to be different on the end of our list here, although safety is going to be one of my bottom two, because I agree with you. There is some uncertainty there. And the fact of the matter is, Rayshawn Jenkins has been a good, not great starter for most of his career. And Kayvon Wallace was on 3 different teams last year. Even though I thought he played well for the Tennessee Titans and Arizona Cardinals, he had a really difficult time keeping a job. And so you're talking about some 1- and 2-year contracts on journeyman to an extent. And then Julian Love, Pro Bowler last year, but the play was very up and down, particularly early in the season. I want to see if he can replicate how he did the second half and do it for an entire year. Can he play at that level in Mike Macdonald's defense? So I have my questions about safety, but I actually am going a little different direction here. I've still got the off-ball linebackers standing out as the biggest weakness for this Seahawks defense, because when I look at what they did this offseason, Jerome Baker has been a solid starter in the league in 6 years of the Dolphins, but he's never been a Pro Bowler, never been an all-pro kind of player, got cut earlier in the offseason. So he is a solid stopgap at minimum, but I don't know that he's a long-term option. Tyrell Dodson, he started 10 games last year, had 5 starts his entire career before last season. That still feels like somebody there's not a big enough sample size to really know what you have there. And then the player that they drafted, Tyrese Knight, I think has a very high ceiling as a 4th-round pick. With that said, I had a 6th-round grade on him because I feel like his game is very unpolished, particularly when it comes to instincts, reading keys, and not getting baited on misdirection. There are a lot of things he's got to clean up in his game. I don't know when we're going to see him ready to play on defense moving forward. So I just don't feel like this is a position group that Seattle has a true long-term solution right now, unless Tyrese Knight develops into that player. And there's a lot of questions about that. And you get 2 veterans that are on 1-year deals. John Radigan, we don't know what's going to happen with him. Maybe they do the same thing they did with Mike Jackson, his contract. But there's a drop-off with very little experience on this roster after the first 2 guys. And Tyrell Dodson isn't exactly a seasoned vet. He's mostly been a special teams guy. So I've got linebacker last on my list. I've got safety at 4, because at least you do have players like Julian Love and Rayshawn Jenkins who have been quality starters for multiple years in the league. There's positional versatility there. There are certainly question marks there as well, though.
No, there's no doubt about it. And I think just real quick on those off-ball linebackers, that was my next position group I was going to list here, 4th of the 5 defensive positions here. I am intrigued by Tyrell Dodson and Tyrese Knight in particular. Those 2. Jerome Baker, I feel like, is the most polished of the bunch. I think like he's going to be a quality starter for the Seahawks, perhaps better in coverage than what Seattle has seen at the off-ball linebacker position since the great KJ Wright was in his prime. But at the same time, I don't think that he is going to provide the physicality that Tyrell Dodson and Tyrese Knight and perhaps John Radigan. To me, those are the top 4 inside linebackers, or off-ball linebackers as we're calling them, I think, on the roster at this point. I'm really intrigued by Drake Thomas as well, NC State, a guy that signed a year ago as a free agent. I felt like the Seahawks stole him from the Raiders. It remains to be seen, of course, that what he's going to be able to do for Seattle, if he's going to be healthy enough for his full return. Patrick O'Connell is another one. But at the same time, again, to me, there are the top 3 positions, which you might be able to see up there already: defensive tackle, cornerback, and edge rushers for me. And then I think there's a drop-off. I think that off-ball linebacker and safety, to me, are definitely the 2 lower positional groups. So transitioning here to the edge rushers, Corbin, I am as intrigued by what Seattle could have at the edge rusher position as just about anybody, I believe. There's no doubt about, we talked ad nauseum about the drop off that we saw when the Seahawks did and did not have a healthy Uchenna Nwosu on the field for them. Obviously, that the pass rush skills of Boye Mafe started to blossom a year ago, but are they really going to get better, or is this kind of as good as things are going to get? That, of course, is going to be one of the fascinating storylines. Speaking of fascinating, I am fascinated by Darrell Taylor. That burst, that bend, I think in a defense that has a little bit more to protect him, I think he could have a splashy season. So again, and Derek Hall, of course, the second round pick from a year ago. There's just so many intriguing storylines about the Seahawks edge rushers. I feel like we should dedicate, not only an entire segment, but an entire show to them here soon.
Yeah, that really is a boom or bust position as much as any, because it feels like there could be 3 or 4 players that really have strong seasons, but we just haven't seen consistency from Darrell Taylor, particularly in the run defense aspect. We don't know what to expect in year 2 from Derek Hall. What does year 3 look like for Boye Mafe? Can he build off last year, or is he going to have trouble replicating the success that he had? And you've got a new scheme on top of it. So there's going to be a lot of questions there. I'm in agreement with you. I've got it at number 3. It feels like a middle of the road position group for the Seahawks. As far as the top 2, this one was actually kind of tricky for me. And it's surprising because in the past, and we talked about this 2 months ago, I had corner head and shoulders above every other position group here. And Seattle drafted 2 corners on day 3 to add to the group. But you bring in Byron Murphy the second with your 16th overall pick. That defensive line that already had Leonard Williams, Draymond Jones, Jaron Reed. You've got Mike Morris coming back. You added Jonathan Hankins. That makes it tricky here for me to just say, oh, this is all about the corners. But I'm still going corners first because I just think Devon Witherspoon has the potential to be a perennial all-pro weapon in the secondary. I'm not even going to call him a corner. I'm not going to call him a safety. I'm going to call him a weapon. He's that kind of a player. Reek Woolen, I'm really curious to see how he responds to playing for a different coach, because Pete Carroll got so much out of him as a rookie. Last year was a little bit more of a struggle for him. What do you see from him in his 3rd season? You've got Mike Jackson, you got Trey Brown, both guys that are very capable of being a starter on the outside. And then you've got some other solid veterans like Artie Burns. I still think Kobe Bryant can play. I'm just trying to figure out where he's going to fit into this puzzle with all the talent and young players the Seahawks have in the secondary. I still feel like the corner spot is the best on defense, but I think that the margin between them and the defensive line has closed. And that should be really good news for the Seattle Seahawks. And the corners should be excited about that too, because that means more pass rushing from the interior to go with their edge rushers. And maybe that makes life a little easier for that corner group that's already got a lot of talent.
Yeah, no question about it. And you mentioned all the names as far as the defensive line group, which again I have as the top group here. But it's just the fact that I was surprised that Seattle was able not only to retain Leonard Williams and draft Byron Murphy II, but also bring in a true nose guard in Jonathan Hankins, who of course Adam Durde is going to know very well from their time together in Dallas. I am excited about the possibilities of the big Michigan defensive lineman, Mike, I'm spacing the last name.
Mike Morris.
Mike Morris, exactly. I almost said Mike Macdonald there, but I think he's going to be playing a different role on Seahawks Sunday. But anyways, as well as Cameron Young, as well as, just Seattle's entire defensive line to me feels like a legitimate game-wrecking possible unit, and that's one of the things that's I'm most intrigued by. As we talked about so many times, of course, this unit struggled in run defense a year for the last several years now, but it feels like they got one of the best run stuffers in all of the NFL, in my opinion, in Jonathan Hankins in free agency. Not that he can play a lot of roles, but that one specific role I feel that he can be very, very effective in. You've got one of the toughest defensive linemen remains on your team in Jaron Reed, and now I was kind of questioning if that was going to be the case. Leonard Williams' versatility, Byron Murphy's upside, explosiveness. To me, there's so many things. Oh, by the way, Draymond Jones, who should be just kind of chomping at the bit to prove that last year was just a tough season. And I do think that he has the talent to excel in Mike Macdonald's system with Mike Morris next to him. And so again, I just am so intrigued by this defensive tackle group that's why I'm listing them above. I think that you can make a strong argument, as you did, sir, with cornerback being listed as Seattle's top group. But I do think that this is the group that if the Seahawks are going to make a real postseason run, this is going to have to be the group that leads them to that.
When we come back, we're going to continue our undrafted rookie profiles. We're going to be on offense at receiver and on defense looking at Nelson Caesar. Going to be having some fun here looking at a couple prospects the Seahawks sign as priority free agents. That'll be coming up next year on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Monopoly Go. All right, we are officially game off here. We got to pause to talk more about Monopoly Go. And I know what you're saying. There's a flag on the play. You already talked about that, but there's just so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with your friends for timed tournaments. You can work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much you can get, such as unique stickers you can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes. They've got cool new playing pieces to travel your boards with and hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings, and you don't have to worry about getting fined by Roger Goodell. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton of those include unique mini games like digging for treasure or the robot machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now for free on Google Play or on the App Store. Game on. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there that are listening in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate your support. Continuing our undrafted rookie signee profiles, we've covered 4 players to this point. We've looked at a lot of big school undrafted free agents, and that's going to change up things a little bit here today because we are going to an FCS program. Used to be an FBS school, but the Idaho Vandals in the Kibbe Dome, they now play in the FCS again. They took a step backwards, but one player that has been very much on the rise the last couple years as a potential NFL player, wide receiver, Hayden Hatten, coming from the Vandals. And Rob, I know that this is somebody that you have followed closely. You actually got to watch him perform at his pro day this offseason. So break down Hayden Hatten a little bit, because this is a guy with over 1,000 receiving yards each of the last 2 years. And oh, by the way, he caught 93 receptions and 9 touchdowns last year. I don't care what level you're playing at. Those are incredible numbers. And this kid's got a lot of NFL caliber skills as a receiver.
No, he really does. This is Jake Bobo all over again. I mean, this is a really good football player that the biggest concern about him is straight line speed. He ran a 4.70 at the pro day. He's 6'2", he's 210 pounds. He had a 39-inch vertical jump, so he's got some explosiveness to him. He catches everything that's in his zip code. He is just a saint on and off the field in terms of his practice habits and just who he is as a human being. The people at Idaho, you mentioned the Kibbe Dome. I mean, they rave about this young man, as well as his brother, long snapper Hogan Hatton. Just an unbelievable person that you're rooting for. I just question whether or not he has the straight line speed to be able to make this roster. This is a new coaching staff, as we talked about so many times. I don't know that Jake Bobo is a guarantee to make this roster. This is the team that Ryan Grubb has prioritized straight line speed in the past at the wide receiver position. You think back to those Husky guys, Adunze and Jalen McMillan and Jalen Polk. I mean, they were all 4.4 guys. And so again, I think that is going to be a struggle for Hayden Hatten. But in terms of his hands, in terms of his route running, in terms of his body control, in terms of his ability on special teams, ability to make the big play in big moments. I mean, he was huge in Idaho's win over Montana, a team that they don't beat very often. unbelievable player. As you mentioned some of the statistics in the last 25 games, Corbin, he's got 25 touchdowns. He's got almost 2,500 receiving yards. I mean, he is just the epitome of consistency. Again, it's this lack of elite 40-yard dash. And I'd argue the same thing with Nelson Caesar, the edge rusher from Houston. You look at his production, 9.5 sacks, led the Big 12 this past season, but also ran a 4.89 40-yard dash time. And when you're 6'3", 250 pounds, I don't know that that's going to cut it. But then there's no doubt about it. Like Hayden Hatten, I think Nelson Caesar is a terrific football player, does a lot of the little things well. And that could get him a spot on the squad.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at these two players, in the case of Hayden Hatten, as you mentioned, there are tons of football skills here. The thing that jumped out to me when I've watched a few Idaho games since he signed with the Seahawks is the ability to win contested catches and jump balls. And that's where that 39-inch vertical comes into play. This is a guy that at Idaho, they just chucked the ball up and said, hey, you go get it. And he can do it. He can go up and high point the football, win those contested situations. And there's a toughness to him in the way that he runs his routes, catching balls over the middle of the field. He's just been a ball magnet when it's thrown in his direction. I wonder about the ability to separate. Is that going to be a much bigger problem for him in the NFL than it was in the FCS against much inferior competition? So that's really going to be the question mark. And then when you look at Caesar, as you mentioned, this is not a guy that had great testing numbers. But when you watch the film, it looks like a different caliber of athlete. And this is a player that's played some off-ball linebacker. And there's some really fun clips of him doing that, by the way. But Houston moved him around some off the edge. He rushes with incredible power for a guy of his size. That is where my biggest problem comes into play. And again, as you mentioned, the production last year, 9.5 sacks, 13.5 tackles for loss. He was as productive as any edge defender in the Big 12 conference last year at getting after the run and the quarterback. My biggest concern is the way that he did it, the way that he was successful. It wasn't with an explosive first step where he was ripping past people, flying past people. That's not his game. He is a power rusher, and at 254 pounds, it's difficult to make a living as a power rusher in the NFL. It's tough to do that. Has it happened before? Absolutely. We've seen guys that can turn speed into power. The issue is going to be, is that going to be translatable at the NFL level? This is what I will say, though. If there is some translating ability there and he's able to show a few other tricks that he didn't necessarily show at Houston or didn't have to use, this is a position group. Seattle did not draft an edge rusher. They didn't sign anybody else in undrafted free agency that has near the talent that Nelson Caesar does. And there's a big drop-off after those first couple of guys, unless you're going to get those big step forward from Darrell Taylor and Derek Hall. This is a position group where an undrafted rookie could come in and make things interesting because, again, you've got a new coaching staff. Mike Macdonald and company, they don't have any allegiance to these former players that arrived in the Pete Carroll era. And so if Nelson Caesar is a guy that fits what Mike Macdonald wants at that position, he has a strong offseason program, training camp, preseason, and he's able to put some of the stuff on tape we saw in college, he could very well be a threat, especially with his special team potential to make this football team.
Yeah, 2 block kicks over his career, and as you mentioned, he's got power to him. He does have some first step quickness, but it's not explosive enough, I think, to consistently beat NFL tackles. So he is very reliant on his snap anticipation. He had a bunch of penalties a year ago where he was just a tick too early, but also some of the most impressive sacks that you're ever going to see because he does time the ball right and basically leaves the tackles standing at the altar when he just kind of goes by him. I mean, he has some incredible, speed rushes, and you talked about the power. I mean, he's got a couple where he locks his arm out and drives guys onto the ground and basically folds them like Kmart chairs. I mean, it is impressive. Some of his highlight reel plays. At the same time, he is still very raw. He does still need to kind of, you wonder about how big he is. Is he going to be able to kind of add any more weight? He's already, when you see a picture of him or those fans out there, he's got kind of a round face and kind of a stocky body. And so I don't know that he's going to be able to add much good weight to him. And as I mentioned before, with the 4.89, 4.90, 40-yard dash time, that's the concern that people had. But, He's a player coming out of Houston, Corbin. Years ago, the Seahawks were interested in a guy that came out of Texas A&M as an undrafted free agent, Michael Bennett, that also was a bit of a tweener, that also could incorporate his hands and would surprise people with his initial quickness when he timed the snap right. So frustrate you sometimes with some of the penalties as well. It's a bad comparison, but there is a pathway for this young man to make it into the NFL. And as you just said, the Seahawks perhaps have the best pathway because of the drop off of edge rusher talent on their squad.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to have not one but two episodes. We're going to continue our NFL Draft Coaches series, breaking down one of Seattle's 8 incoming draft picks. And it is our annual episode. My mother will be joining as a co-host, and we are going to rank every quarterback on the Seahawks schedule. Should be an absolute blast. So make sure you're listening into both those shows. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and thanks for listening. Go Hawks.